From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, St. Louis Public Radio, and the Danforth Center present Conversations, a discussion about prairies, conservation, and energy.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Hal Burrows, and I'm the chairman of the Conversations Committee here at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center. In my day job, I'm an attorney at Bryan Cave, so any knowledge regarding the conversation topic this evening is purely coincidental. Anyway, thank you for joining us this evening. As we talk about the role of prairies in conservation of natural ecosystems and their importance for production of next-generation biofuels. When I learned that I had the privilege of introducing this evening's program, all I could think of was Jane Fonda and the movie The China Syndrome. And I can remember some nuclear scientist commenting how terrible it was that Americans were getting their knowledge of nuclear energy from Jane Fonda. So when the conversation comes to pass, I'll be stepping off the stage. A word of thanks to our Friends Committee and to the Conversations Committee for their continued support and commitment to this program. As we get ready to start our program, let us recall the mission of the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, which is to improve the human condition through plant science, feed the hungry, and improve human health, preserve and renew our environment, and enhance the St. Louis region as a world center for plant science. I'd now like to say a word of thanks to this evening's sponsors, St. Louis Public Radio and HEC-TV. Thanks to a supportive community, the Danforth Center can not only host these programs, but carry out its important work. We have a large audience today. During this evening's program, we will incorporate Twitter as a means to collect questions for our distinguished panel from the audience, as well as from others who will follow the conversation remotely. I know some of you are really thrilled about the fact that Twitter is available to you. I know that. For those of you who tweet, I'm not asking you to raise your hands. Please tweet us your question at Danforth Center and view selected tweets on our tweet wall. The hashtag for the event is hashtag CONVOSTL. The use of Twitter is simply a way for us to share the discussion and expand awareness of the exciting things happening at the Danforth Center and in our region. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, Chip Lerwick. Chip is an active Danforth Leadership Council member, as well as our distinguished panelists, Peter Raven, President Emeritus of the Missouri Botanical Garden and one of the world's leading botanists, along with Rudy Raceline. Rudy's the CEO of Raceline Associates, Inc., and founder of Raceline Alternative Energy. Without further ado, the conversation.
Thank you, Hal. I'll start by briefly thanking the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center and the Friends Committee for the opportunity. It's an honor. It's very humbling and a pleasure to be up here tonight to help with this audience and with this panel. I have happened to get to know Rudy over the last couple of years and really have enjoyed understanding his vision through many conversations, but most importantly, just feeling his passion for this plan that you'll learn more about tonight. I have, in my day job, I have a role that allows me to look at risk in the food and agribusiness industry, which makes this topic tonight particularly interesting because tonight we're talking about prairies, conservation, and energy, an interesting combination of words. Some of you may have even seen in previous conversations prairie as a subject. Tonight, the introduction of the word energy should be a curiosity, and I think at the end of this tonight, you'll find that you have a lot of respect and admiration for the ideas that are presented here tonight. But I am, again, honored, and I look forward to the opportunity. So tonight, I want to start by introducing the concept of kind of the global issues that set the paradigm for this conversation tonight. And I'm going to ask Dr. Raven if he might, just to start us off talking about some of the global issues relative to climate change and food and energy production and agriculture, some of the overlying factors that make this conversation about prairies so important?
Thank you. I need to start out, I think, by reflecting on the day when we were out at a meeting in Irvine, California, and Bill Danforth drew Ginny Weldon and me into a bar, into a table in a bar, and said, I want to talk to you about something. At that time, we couldn't have imagined this. It was just astonishing. And somebody said later, though, when I told them about it, that if Bill Danforth summoned you into a bar, you should have known you were really in trouble. To lay the general picture, I was very inspired by my colleague Daniel Jansen's comment. He's a biologist at the University of Pennsylvania and really one of the founders of tropical biology. The world is a garden, and we're all the gardeners. We're all the gardeners. That's pretty much what it says in the second chapter of Genesis when it says, God put man on earth to save and preserve it. What kind of a job we're doing to save and preserve it is getting increasingly doubtful, and as the doubt grows, it raises more and more questions about what we all should do. Just as an aside, I'll say, to me, one of the most thoughtless, confusing, and misleading articles I've read recently was that dumb article in the New York Times saying that the population problem had disappeared and it was all kind of fraudulent. That kind of an article is about the equivalent of drinking a couple of martinis at noontime and then going into work for the rest of the day. You know, if you look up the website, which I strongly recommend, Footprint Network, which is the Global Footprint Network, a think tank in Oakland, California, which tries to estimate the amount of the sustainable resilience in the world that we use on an ongoing basis. How much of it do we use up every year? Well, when Paul, who's a very good friend of mine, was writing The Population Bomb with his wife Anne in the late 1960s, we were using about 70% of the world's resilience and sustainability, the human race was, at about half, at less than half of what it is now. Now, their estimate is that we're using up about 156% of it. In other words, we use up all of the sustainable resilience in the world by August of every year. And if you look up that website and try to reason with what they're saying, they do present the background for everything and the calculations for everything. And if you can prove them wrong, hallelujah. Otherwise, to talk about population consumption, which goes with it, and technology not being problems for the future of the earth, good luck. Werner Arber, a Nobel Prize winner and head of the president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, a group of about 80 of us who advise the Pope, non-denominational, on matters of science and technology, said, it's time for us to stop worrying about our children and grandchildren and time for us to start worrying about whether the conditions of the world will be such as to allow what we consider civilization to go on much beyond the next 30 or 60 years. We tend to look at prosperous countries like the United States with high levels of consumption, and we tend to forget that we use about twice as much as we can produce in the United States to get to that level. Japan uses about 7 times as much in Japan to support their standard of living as they can produce or do internally. And I don't mean food, I mean all human activities which keep up the standard of living. Not strange then that the Japanese government a few years ago, actually a few months ago, said we might have to begin rethinking the question of level of standard of living here in Japan. And the same way we look at big cities and we say, well, that's doing really well. Why isn't everything else doing really well? And why aren't there cities between them? Well, if you read Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis, about the history of Chicago, you'll find that a city casts a shadow over an enormous distance beyond it and is supported by it. And that's the situation we're in the world, and that's why it's so desperately misleading and mindless to talk about there's no population problem. if we are all the gardeners, how are we going to be the gardeners? Well, we all have to figure out how to put together a more sustainable world that will fit together. Not only do we have to address the kinds of social problems that the Pope will bring out in his encyclical on the environment and morality, which is going to be issued on the 18th of this month, but we're going to have to take all the parts and learn how to work them for maximum advantage and maximum sustainability. And who's doing that? Well, the Danforth Center, the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, is doing a marvelous job of that in thinking about what kinds of sustainable crops, what kinds of scientific advances, what kinds of input are going to be required to make the world sustainable, not only in terms of food, in a world where with a record 7.3 billion people, compared to 1 billion when the Battle of Waterloo was fought 200 years ago, 7.3 billion people, but a world in which 850 million of us are actually malnourished and 220,000 babies net are being added every day. The Missouri Prairie Foundation, which put up that elegant display in the hall, is doing a wonderful job with concerned individuals setting aside the 0.1% of Missouri's prairie that's still left for a variety of reasons, which will come out in the course of the discussion. And Rudy Reslin is doing a fantastic job in conceiving what kinds of prairie, perennial grassland, would actually be able to support people, be put in place because of its economic and environmental benefits, and help to carry us on into the future. But each and every one of us, in the light of what we're facing, has a responsibility not only to do that, but to stop kidding ourselves about climate change, about population, and about all these other things, writing special exemptions for ourselves, and get on with the job of being the kinds of gardeners that Dan Jansen challenged us all to be.
Significant
Thanks,
challenges, to say the least. And that was exactly what we wanted to do to start this conversation. We've got some big issues, big problems ahead of us, and how we're going to solve those is the interesting part of this next phase of the discussion. And Rudy, I would have you, for the audience, one, describe Prairie, if you will, briefly, and tell us how does it play a role in addressing some of these global issues, and particularly how are we going to more sustainably grow our food?
Well, before I do that, I want to thank Dr. Raven. Dr. Raven has mentored me for the last 7 years in this vision that I have about how do we take the waste and the problems that we have in producing food and turn a waste into a positive thing. But more importantly, as we look at land and what is now classified as marginal land, who decides it's marginal? Does the wildlife that lives there decide it's marginal? Or do we decide based on the number of bushels of beans and corns that we can get from that land? And so I've had the good fortune of traveling all over the world. I immigrated to the United States in 1956 with my parents at the age of 8. I feel, I'm one of the luckiest people in the world to have come here and live in this society. But over the last 30 years, I've had the good fortune of building these huge industrial facilities all over the world. And as I traveled, I always tried to get out into the hinterlands, sometimes to the chagrin of some of the local population because of the danger I was putting myself in. But it was mostly to see, was there wildlife and what did the fauna look like? Was there fauna at all, or were just landscapes? And a good portion of the last 30 years has also been traveling back and forth to Asia and specifically China. I just came back from a trip to China where I have an operation where 30 years ago, I was building these huge beverage can plants. If you drink out of a can, I probably had something to do with it. If you eat out of a Campbell soup can, I probably had something to do with it. And I've taken that technology all over the world. But as I did, and I built these facilities, I still had this other side of me. As I grew up in Austria, I grew up in the Alpine little small village, and it was with a little cloister with nuns. And I had this beautiful stream that was going through there, and my mother said that even at 5 years old, I would disappear and somehow magically find my way back, and just drove her absolutely crazy. And so I think I'm kind of like a salmon that has to keep going back And so I got involved with land very early. I bought land when Judy and I first got married, and I've always been involved in land. And I've learned to nurture land and to really develop. And I can't describe that on stressful weekends where I was really involved in all sorts of industrial projects, and I'd go out to my land and how it would recharge me. So there's a connection between me and land that I can't fully express, just to say that I've had this affinity for land. And as I traveled around the world, you know, I've noticed the same thing Peter talks so eloquently about. When I came to the United States, we had 150 million people. Today, we have 300 million people. And when I go to China, there's 1.3 billion people. And if you travel the eastern quarter of China and look at it as a window into the future, it's quite frightening. The devastation to the rivers and streams and the landscape and the amount of pure earth that is moved is just, to me, is unfathomable. When I look at having gone there 30 years ago and what I see today, I think Dr. Raven mentioned to me this morning, they've used more concrete in the last 5 years than we've used in the entire 20th century. And you know, I see highways that have sprung up. I see entire cities that have sprung up. And it's all a result of this population growth that some people want to ignore. So how do we feed people? You know, I hear a lot of discussion about confined animal units and not being able to, you know, continue that process. I hear a lot of controversy about what we should eat and how we should eat. But the ability to feed almost 9 billion people in the next 50 years is going to be a serious challenge. And what we've started to look at through some processes that we went through is, what can we do with this waste? Can we do something with it beyond just considering it waste? And so we happen to be involved in something that, through the Missouri Prairie Foundation and learning through the Missouri Prairie Foundation, and something that actually came to light, and it's prairie. You know, I got involved with Dr. David Tillman almost 5 years ago. I visited Dr. David Tillman and studied the research that he'd done on the diversity of plant life. At the same time, I was also planting prairie and restoring prairie on my own farm, primarily for wildlife habitat. I wanted wildlife. And through the process of working with prairie, we learned, my son and I learned a lot of things. One is that when you burn it, there's a lot of energy that goes up. And sometimes you do need to burn prairie just to sustain it. So what I see prairie is a diversity of hundreds of different species. But it's not just the species above the ground, it's also the species of microbes below the ground that I think we still know so little about. I think we discover more about our outer space adventures than we do what's below the ground. And the symbiotic relationships between these plants and what's below the ground is so important for the entire food chain. And we're just starting to learn that. And it's because of the Missouri Prairie Foundation that I really developed a passion for prairie and understood prairie and what prairie could potentially do, both to provide ecological services and to provide wildlife habitat. And then later on formed this concept that potentially it could become a feedstock. And in becoming a feedstock, potentially it has economic value that farmers want to plant it. Because as a person in my position and my financial position, I can have altruistic reasons for wanting prairie. But at the end of the day, you know, I think Aldo Leopold put it correctly when he said, we live in a society of economic expediency. And so we need to figure out how can we provide an economic value to that prairie. And the way we look at things now in farmland as an asset is how many acres do we have, what are our input costs, and what are the net result of how many bushels of corn and bean are we going to derive from that. But we tend not to look at, you know, what does that land serve in terms of sequestering CO2? What does it serve as far as providing for pollinators? What does it serve as actually taking our water and putting it back into the soil and into our aquifers? So starting to look at land as an asset that provides different things than just food is very important. And so to me, prairie is a living organism. You know, I think I don't know how many times I've read Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, but the real gist of his book is that we need to understand we can't treat land like we treated our slaves 200 years ago. It's not a disposable piece of property. It's a living organism, and we need to learn to appreciate that it is a living organism. And how it supports us is important, because if it doesn't support the food chain and the wildlife and the animals that it supports, ultimately it won't support us. So that's the real challenge I see as we go from 7.3 million. How are we going to provide enough food And are we going to use proper land for energy, or are we going to use it for food, or can we do both? And that's the real challenge that I see going forward.
So you've touched on a couple of the benefits of prairie and carbon sequestration, water sequestration, the biodiversity. But talk to us a little bit more about that, because I think the benefits of prairie are so critical to really understanding the value that's brought back out of some of the efforts that you have underway. For instance, one of the things that we know is happening is we've got some tremendous pressure on pollinators with bees in the decline, and we're not sure. There's a lot of factors in that, but one of them is likely land use issues. Talk to us a little bit about what benefits prairie offer to pollinators.
Well, when you look at the diverse number of species in a real prairie, and there's hundreds of them, I'd like to tell you that I was, completely educated on all the different species. We all tend to have species that we like. I tend to like flowers that are on the purple range, and there's a lot of the forbs that I really have come to admire, and it's the same thing with trees. Aldo likes certain types of trees, and we all tend to have a preference. But the diversity of those species and how many bugs they supported and pollinators they supported that also then support birds. It isn't just our pollinators. I mean, for the people that have been watching quail for the last 30 or 40 years, quail have become, to my mind, almost endangered in some states. There's very few quail left in southern states where they were one of the dominant birds that everybody had a tradition of hunting. There's just so few of them, that tradition is going away. And it's not a mystery to me. It's habitat. It's all about habitat, whether it's rabbit, whether it's pheasants, whether it's quail, whether it's our grassland birds. It's all about habitat. And that diversity of those plants is what provided that habitat. It provided that food. And we had 17 million acres in Missouri. We're down to less than 95,000 acres. And a few of the gems that we have is being preserved by the Nature Conservancy, by the Prairie Foundation, and by the Missouri Department of Conservation. And they've been doing this for 50 years without most people even knowing they're in the background doing this. But what they provide is a gem to look at and say, what is a real prairie? And I'm not just talking about what's happening above the ground, but also to look at what is soil health? How do you define a healthy ecosystem in terms of soil? And so those prairie systems that are still out there can tell us a lot about the potential of recreating or reconstructing those kind of prairies.
They're valuable.
They're extremely valuable.
It's really important. And you've mentioned a couple of statistics relative to how much prairie is left in the state of Missouri. What do we have left in this country of the historical prairies?
Well, how I was really introduced to prairie was, kind of a selfish thing. I am a hunter, and I used to go to Manhattan, Kansas, and Wamega, Kansas, where there is a large amount of prairie, and it was saved because of the Flint and the Flint Hills. And those Flint Hills are kind of the backbone of central Kansas. They go all the way up, they go down into the Oklahoma region, and they go up into Nebraska. That prairie is really what introduced me, kind of in a selfish way, to the value of prairie. My son and I had worked for years on building all these food plots. We didn't call them cover crops. We built food plots in the wintertime to sustain our wildlife. And we always try to grow animals that were healthy, that weighed a lot, and had very large antlers. So in the middle of this prairie, where you would think that it's a wasteland of nothing but grasses and weeds, I killed the largest deer I've ever killed in my life, and really started thinking about, how can the nutrients, and so as I dug into the prairies, I found out the deep-rooted systems bring up nutrients from very deep in the ground, and between the forbs and the various other plants that are there, they provide those nutrients. And so I think, if you look at the backbone of Kansas and parts of Nebraska, we still do have a lot of remnants, but they're there because people have learned they don't grow cattle there, they grow grass. And the grass is what sustains those cattle. So they do have remnants, but they were saved primarily because we couldn't put the plow to them because of all the flint.
So before we get into talking a little bit about your grand vision and idea, I'd like to know, Dr. Raven, what obstacles do you see to us expanding our prairies? And these might be a number of things, but from your perspective, what obstacles do you see with our expanding prairie?
Probably to start again with a global perspective, it's kind of important to realize that steppes in Eastern Europe and Asia, pampas in Argentina and all are all prairies. about, and we just call them prairies here, about 11% of the world's land surface is food production, crop production, and another 20% is grazing, is animal production. And most of that is on natural grassland, and most of that is not sustainable. In other words, it's being grazed so hard that it's giving way, and of course, or converted or something else. And as I said at the beginning, we really have to think of it as a giant jigsaw puzzle in which we're filling in the pieces with as much stability, sustainability as we possibly can. And if you combine that with getting an economic return from what we're doing, as well as an ecological return, a return in environmental services, then you come to ideas like Rudy's. But there's grasslands all over the world which are playing this similar function. They're being badly hammered by grazing, plowing up, and changing to agriculture. And the question here is really, is that an appropriate part in the jigsaw puzzle of life on Earth? Can help to make our whole planet more sustainable. We don't feed the 7.3 billion people that we have now adequately. About half of them lack at least one essential nutrient, and about 850 million of them are malnourished, and about 100 million are on the verge of starvation at any point in time. Yet with 220,000 babies net every day, we're soaring upward. Sub-Saharan Africa has about 850 million people right now. 35 years from now, it's projected to have 2.3 billion people. 850 million to 2.3 billion in 35 years. Tell me, if you will, how we can feed those people. Remember, we're starting from a huge deficit, so we've really got an extraordinary problem. Reversing the trend of destruction on these grasslands and restoring them to productive, sustainable systems, of which the kinds of prairies that we have here are a very logical candidate, is really important. Finally, I would just say 3% of Iowa is trees, is forest, and that's more forest than they had there before Europeans began to plow it up.
Wow, that's interesting. That's interesting. So Rudy, I'd like at this time for you to kind of walk us through your idea, in particular to let us know how is it that we're going to create energy from prairies, and where's that connection? Describe for us, if you will, your bold vision.
Well, again, just going down a vision of where are you, where do you want to go, and how did you get there? So part of it is again, as I traveled around the world and built these industrial facilities, especially as I went to China, I would come home almost frantic, and I'd feel like I needed to do something. And through that process, I actually was introduced to the Missouri Prairie Foundation through one of the conservation aides. Missouri has a wonderful program with private land managers that it will actually assist you. Many of them are either from the wildlife field or biologists or they're botanists, and they have an array of experience and can help. And so, whereas as an engineer, I looked at everything as a construction project, these guys looked at it more holistically. And so they helped us build Prairie. And on one of the burning processes, we were actually burning one of the prairies as general maintenance. I started thinking, again as an engineer, and thinking about the BTUs that were going up into the atmosphere without being used. And it was actually creating these little tornadoes, and I started thinking about, I wonder how many BTUs that is. And so I started doing some research. And again, I ran across Dr. David Tillman's research about the biodiversity of prairie. And so this is not a Rudy Raceline hatched idea. Dr. Tillman believed that prairie was a much better biomass than many of the monolithic plants that are being actually projected. We're looking at plants like miscanthus. We're looking at pure switchgrass, again, which are monolithic plants. And although from a yield standpoint, they may yield much more per ton, per acre than a mixture of prairie grasses, they would not provide the ecological services. They would not provide the wildlife habitat. And so my thoughts were, if we can provide something that not only provides a source of energy, but also provides ecological services, provides for pollinators, and provides for many of the things that are troubling us today. So what do we have as problems? I mean, we have a tremendous amount of problems with the waste from animals going onto our landscape. The nitrogen and phosphorus from those animals are going into our river. The city of Des Moines is suing the EPA over the cost of $1 million to remove nitrates from our water. And people say, well, how are we affected in cities by something like Prairie? Each one of our cities have water treatment facilities all up and down the Missouri and the Mississippi River. The nitrates and phosphorus from those rivers aren't just point pollution anymore from industry. They also come from an overabundance of nitrates and phosphorus from application of agriculture and also land waste. So I ran into a situation where I thought, if we could find a biomass that we could grow around our rivers, around our streams, around our lakes, and in areas of highly erodible land, and use that highly erodible land to produce something that provides ecological services, now it would also provide energy. And so I went to Germany for 2 or 3 years. The Germans have over 8,000 anaerobic digestion systems. And an anaerobic digestion system is what happens naturally and occurs naturally in nature and produces methane over thousands of years. Well, they've developed a process where they can, through batch processes of large tanks, they can produce methane in as little as 30 days. And then what they do is they combine manure, and the manure has the bacteria to start the process, but they also then add other substrates. The unfortunate thing is they add food substrates. They add corn, they add sorghum, they add beets, they add many things. But what they've done is they've actually covered their winter grounds with cover crops. And instead of spraying those cover crops, they also use those cover crops as a biomass material. So I started talking to some of the technologists there and said, is there a possibility that we could use a broad variety of both forbs and grasses and mix them together and put them into these anaerobic digesters, combine them with the waste from animal products, and now have a source of not only biomass, but we would also have a biomass that provided ecological services around our rivers and streams. And also, what I saw in Germany is that most farmers all depend on agriculture. Most industries want to be involved in more than one marketplace. My business went to the brink of death almost twice because we were primarily in one marketplace. And until we started to get into other industries and other marketplaces, did we balance that out. So we have an opportunity to make farmers and put them in a position where their assets can be used not only for farming, but for energy and ecological services. So now they would have 3 legs on their stool. They start, young people wouldn't leave the farm because now they become technologists. And that's what I saw in Germany. I saw a lot of young people that were extremely energetic and excited about the fact they weren't just going out from dusk to dawn taking care of their cattle. Now they were also taking care of these sophisticated anaerobic digestion systems that produce electricity or produce methane that can be purified and goes directly into the gas. And the thing that I think excited me the most is the level of enthusiasm I saw from these people now that always had enthusiasm for land, but now they didn't see themselves as just farmers anymore. They saw themselves as producers of energy. And the thing that I try to introduce them, then what about ecological services? What if you produced a product that also provided ecological services? And eventually, I see a slow progression towards an eco-commerce. We'll actually be getting carbon credits, and I think government can play a role in promoting these kinds of concepts and actually, recognize that these new technologies and these new sources of alternative energy cannot compete initially with oil. There's nothing that's going to compete with oil. You can't produce any other form of BTUs and energy as cheaply as you can do with oil. So you have to start with a platform that allows some incentives to move some of these alternative energies. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this conundrum as we are now, where they reduce the cost of oil to a point where most of the fracking and much of the gas extraction and the oil exploration in the U.S. is really winding down and almost stopping again.
Well, the idea is, it's particularly compelling to me when I look at how do you actually get 30 million acres of prairie into production, and you have to think about engaging private landowners. And what we heard here just now is an idea that actually creates an economic advantage for some of the farmers to cede part of their land that won't necessarily be just to grow prairie grass for that sake alone, of which they're paid, but it creates the ecological services that really make this a particular benefit to the land. I'm curious, Dr. Raven, as you think about this model and idea, is this transportable to other parts of the world? Or is it unique to
No, of course
this
it
region?
is. Of course it is. Or any part of the world that depends a lot on meat, like China, when it really began to move into consuming meat, meat produces 1/10 of the energy per amount that goes into it as crops do, which would, if we were sensible, make us all vegetarians, but it's long ago decided that we're not sensible, so forget that. The grasslands in northern China and Mongolia and so forth have been totally trashed. Native grasslands that used to be very productive because of the demand for meat, and those could very logically begin to be treated in the same kind of way that Rudy is talking about, and made resilient and sustainable again, which would be a great benefit for all of us. And the same could be said about Argentina or any other place where there's a lot of grazing on perennial grasses that people could use.
So I'm going to transition in just a moment to some questions from the audience in this famous tweet wall that we've heard about, so we'll get into that in just a moment. But Rudy, I did want to, I mean, this idea is something I've grown to know quite closely with you, and I know others have heard you talk about this and have claimed that, you're a visionary in thinking about this. I just would like to get your comments on that, as people might claim that.
Well, I think that really there's two types of visionaries. One that truly come up out of the blue with a vision. I can't say that I came out with this vision out of the blue on my own. I'm more of a systems integrator. I look at problems and say, how can these problems be solved? I look at various potential solutions that people have come up with, and then say, how do I integrate that into a holistic solution? Because this problem starts with, what do we do with the manure from 60 million hogs in the United States? What do we do with the manure from 10 million dairy cattle? The amount of methane that is produced for that is all going into the atmosphere right now. So the low-hanging fruit is to capture this methane and put it into an anaerobic digester. From the 2 million pigs that reside in northern Missouri with Smithfield Foods, that problem has been going on, and there was a legal battle over that. There was $50 million spent in legal battles. And instead, that $50 million could have been applied to solutions. But sometimes it takes somebody to take on the challenge and say, I have a solution. And that solution is to turn that methane into renewable natural gas. Gas that we can put in our vehicles, gas that utility companies can use in generating power. And we could actually generate power. The problem with power, and it's called combined heat and power in the United States, is we live in a society that has very, very cheap energy. If you look at your bill, you may think your energy is very expensive, but there's many other parts of the world where we actually don't have power. Nigeria, I've done a lot of business in Nigeria. I've done a lot of business in other African countries, and the cost of electricity is extremely high. So if we were to convert this gas to electricity, the most we could get is 3 to 4 cents. Well, at 3 to 4 cents, with 60% of that electricity going up into heat, because that's what a generator does. It produces a lot of heat. 60% of the BTU would be wasted unless you can use that heat. So what we're doing with our models, we're actually taking that gas, we'll actually clean that gas, because it isn't just pure methane. It has carbon dioxide in it, it has some CH4 in it, it has some nitrous oxide, so we have to purify that. And there are systems available to actually separate those molecules, but what you end up with is 98% methane that you can put into a gas pipeline, and that molecule looks no different than a natural gas molecule that you would take and heat your home with, or burn on your burner on your stove. It is the same molecule.
We've got more natural gas in this country than we know. It's just coming on.
Well,
That's great.
absolutely, and so therein lies the question again, is do we want to continue as a society to only use fossil fuel? And they say that we have more fossil fuel and more gas than we're ever going to use, and even in this entire decade. But at some point, we have to recognize that that comes at a cost. And when you look at diesel and the emissions from diesel versus the emissions from natural gas is 90% cleaner. China alone has over 1.5 million vehicles now running on natural gas. Germany, Poland, Switzerland, many of those countries now run on natural gas, on compressed natural gas. So it's the same thing as oil. Do we want to compare it strictly to that, or do we want to get to where we have a renewable fuel that is sustainable, that slowly moves us away from only having the natural gas that's now being produced through fracking? Much of that gas that is actually discovered is trapped. And there are no gas pipelines, so you have to use compression to put it in vehicles and move it. And all those things end up having a huge impact on the wildlife, especially some of our prairie chickens. When you look at the number of wells that are now drilled in regions that still have some prairie chickens, it has a huge impact on that. This concept would have a positive impact on the environment. This concept would provide jobs in a new technology. This concept would provide clean water and clean air without some of the negative impacts. And so, you know, I keep asking, and the reason I'm here in front of this audience, we do want to be challenged about how we do this and make sure that in the process of doing it, we do it right. And then we don't look at it back 20 years ago and say, well, gee, it's almost like what we did with our corn ethanol, and we have some of the same problems. So we've looked at harvesting methods. We look at when do we harvest, you know, how much do we harvest? How do we handle the material? There's a lot of aspects of this that we've looked at, and we've spent millions of dollars studying and engineering this process to come up with a solution that we hope is truly sustainable. But I'm here in front of this audience today to present this concept and then have intelligent people challenge us about the concept and make sure that as we move forward, we really truly are doing something that's better for society. Because at this stage of my life, my wife is a little upset with me that I'm 67, I should be retiring. And she wonders why I have this almost obsession to do this. And I think it's because what I see in Africa, what I see in many parts of the world, and when I see the turmoil that we have, and I remember how poor my parents were, I empathize with these poor people all over the world, and I feel so lucky to be in this country. We in this country have an obligation to lead the world in these kinds of problems and these kinds of solutions. And I believe you can't sit on the sidelines as a technologist and somebody that has expertise on integrating. You have to participate in the integration of these solutions. And so as far as a visionary, I think I'm an integrator of a lot of people's visions to try to do something and come up with a solution. And hopefully that solution has value beyond just what Aldo said, economic expediency.
Well, we're glad you're doing it. So we're going to take some questions from the audience, so get your phones out, start tweeting now. I'll catch them here on this board. And we'll get a question served up here in just a moment. In the meantime, you know, Rudy's looking for some advice and some feedback. Dr. Raven, any advice for your friend?
Well, you know, there's the obvious point, which you well know, that methane is a greenhouse gas too, like carbon dioxide, and eventually it's much less damaging than burning oil or coal for the global warming. But eventually this will be a transitional stage. But on the other hand, that's a decades-long transitional stage, so it doesn't matter very much. I see no real problems with it. I think that the diet of people worldwide is not likely to be able to support much meat for very much longer when there are a need for doubling our food production in the next couple of decades, you know, just to feed the people who will be around adequately. But again, for decades, we're going to have this huge surplus of manure, and using it that way is superb, so I'd go for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as for his retiring, get over it.
So the first question we'd like to ask is, what techniques are being used to prevent destroying current habitats of wildlife during harvest of prairie landscapes?
Well, first of all, you know, I want to make it very clear what we don't want to do is use existing prairies. what we want to do is use those existing prairies as models. On my own 1,650 acre farm, we've restored over 300 acres of savannas back to native prairies. And we did an inventory of what was there. Again, we got really good advice from the Missouri Department of Conservation. They have a wonderful, and so studying the harvest methodology, when do you harvest? Most of our wildlife in Missouri, deer, birds, all born right about this time. So what we've tended to do, even before we got on this program, is we don't harvest any of our grasses, even our grasses that are cut for hay, until about the middle of July. Now that's not necessarily the time where you have the most nutrients in the grasses, because they do start to get full of lignin, and they're at a point where they, you know, they're not quite as good as most farmers would like. They would like to harvest now.
Get the Danforth Center to take care of the lignin for you.
So I think, you know, establishing a time when you want to harvest, and what we want to do is we want to harvest reconstructed prairie. We don't want to go in and harvest these gems that we have. We have no intention. But what we do want to do is use some of that seed and some of that knowledge from those to actually propagate and reconstruct the new prairies.
This is a great segue into the next question that's coming from the audience. Is there enough of the right genetic material and seed production capacity to optimize prairie production? And this could go to either one of you.
It's a big problem for any kind of restoration, and there's a very heavy ongoing discussion about how true you ought to be to the genetic races of individual species that are near where you are. But it's a chicken and egg story. I mean, I think that Grow Native, which is a program now of the Missouri Department of Agriculture and used to be a program of the Department of Conservation, the garden is very involved in it, is very concerned with, you know, giving farmers alternative crops in growing native plants for reconstructing vegetation in just this way. And I think the demand will produce the supply perfectly well. It's a tough problem right now if you want to start planting.
And so the way we've approached it, for example, at Murphy Brown of Northern Missouri, they committed 15,000 acres to start this process to us. We don't have 15,000 acres of natives, but what we do have is we planted 400 acres with the help of the Missouri Prairie Foundation in cooperation with Fish and Wildlife. And that's really how I was introduced to the whole problem up there. From that 400 acres, if you harvest that seed, you can almost quadruple that, and over a period of 3 years you keep doing that, so you start. But what we have to start with is the grasses that are there, which are predominantly cool season, in order to make an economic model that works. I mean, in industry and in business, there's two important things. One is money and the other is sales. You have to sell something and you have the money to build something. So if the economics aren't there, the project will fail. And so the difficulty always is, how do you get that chicken and egg thing? How do you get the money when people haven't seen that these kinds of projects can actually be demonstrated? We've had a tremendous amount of effort in what's called the second generation biofuels, which is predominantly enzymatic hydrolysis, where we've built, DuPont has built a huge facility, Abengoa has built a huge facility, and the feedstock has been predominantly corn stover. And that's an extremely sophisticated process, and no one yet has commercialized that. The difference between this process is that it's a process in nature. The Germans have 8,000 of these systems. They're actually producing about 7,000 megawatts of electricity, and they're also putting gas into their pipelines with this whole process. And so there's an interim step. You have to use the grasses, but eventually, as Peter has mentioned, that the market, once it sees that this is moving, I think it will propagate, and we can move this thing forward. And we have canvassed the seed producers. I think our first step would be to actually plant 200,000 acres in northern Missouri. We have a grant application to potentially help on that side, so that not only do we plant, but we study what happens over time when we harvest, what happens to the soil, what happens to the wildlife, what happens to the adjacent water. We're working with Missouri University and Iowa State University to actually measure the quality of the water as a result of what we're doing on my farm. And we hope to use that knowledge in going forward so that if we do expand, that we don't make a bunch of mistakes. But as far as the 30 million acres, We have a 30 million acre program right now. It's called CRP. The flaw in CRP is that they allowed fescue, they allowed all sorts of grasses that are non-native grasses that don't support wildlife. And that the fescue ends up bunching up in a period of 10 years, you have predominantly fescue. The other problem is you're not allowed to harvest it, you're not allowed to sell it, you are allowed to burn it, but what tends to happen is that farmers don't do anything, and then in a period of 10 years, you have cedar trees, you have black locusts, and so part of the program could be, with just a small change, is to allow a third of that each year to be marketed as biomass. And then as that program is renewed, we renew it with native grasses, and we start a program. And in 30 years, we could have 30 million acres, because from 1985 until just 5 years ago, we had close to 30 million acres. But we've lost 5 million acres back to corn and beans.
It's probably worth mentioning that cool season grasses on the prairies of Missouri generally means giant fescue, which is introduced from Europe and is not good for cattle grazing anyway. It's a problem for cattle grazing, but it's dominant all over the state. And when we say warm season grasses, those are native. Those are what make up the prairie naturally. And that's not just a trait, it's a deep biochemical difference between those two groups of grasses. The cool season ones growing naturally largely in woods and meadows and things in the mountains or the north, and the warm season ones growing naturally in prairies and grasslands like that in arid places southward, with many exceptions, but that's the general picture. So as you restore warm season grasses, you have a better array of native biodiversity coming back with them, which Rudy said the same thing in slightly different words.
We have just a brief moment for this last question, but I think it's appropriate given we're sitting in St. Louis and in the hub of plant science, and it's a question that I'd like to ask Dr. Raven just to briefly answer. And can you speak to the state of the plant science ecosystem in St. Louis and what we need to step up our game?
Thanks to the efforts of the Danforth family and of Monsanto and of many other people, we have the largest Washington University, University of Missouri St. Louis University, Mizzou in Illinois, which are not far away and which are connected with the Danforth Center. We have the largest group of plant scientists in the St. Louis area, as far as I know, of any metropolitan region in the world. And so we have the most fundamentally excellent ecosystem for making discoveries in plant sciences. It's been slow. We've been slow economically. You know, if you look back at that in startups, if you look back at the book that I mentioned on Nature's Metropolis about Chicago and what their draw was all over the world, they have a chart showing in 1870 or something where St. Louis was borrowing its money and where Chicago was borrowing its money. Chicago was borrowing its money all over the place. St. Louis was borrowing its money only right around St. Louis and a few scattered places in the eastern U.S. And the thing is, we've had a hard time with startups. We have some of the best medical facilities in the world. We've had a hard time with startups, and we've had a lot of immigration of good startups to other places. But that's starting to turn around with the excellent work that Washington University, St. Louis University, and other institutions are doing in Cortex, with the fabulous work that's being done here with the guidance of Sam Fiorello and Jim and the board of the Danforth Center. We're beginning to turn that around. We have an absolute powerhouse in basic research on all aspects of plants here. That basic research on all aspects of plants is woefully neglected worldwide in favor of medical research. We want to live forever, but we've sort of forgotten that if we live forever, we'll have to feed ourselves too and have medicines and things. But that's beginning to turn around, and I give huge credit to Bill for playing a major role in that, and I'd say the future for St. Louis looks very strong. We have the capability. You know why Silicon Valley exists? It's because when Hewlett and Packard, students of Fred Terman at Stanford, were ready to go east to start their business, Fred Terman, their major professor, said, "No, boys, stay here and start your business." And Silicon Valley grew up around that. We need even more of that in St. Louis. We need more federal, state, and other funding for plant science research. But gosh, we're in a good position to capitalize on it all in both intellectual and economic terms if we do keep the faith and stay behind it.
Well, we've got the great ecosystem and brilliant ideas, and I just want to thank Rudy, you, and Dr. Raven for tonight's conversation. It's been enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
I'll introduce Jim Carrington, President of the Danforth Center, to close us out.
All right, thank you very much. My job is to say something that wraps up the program, and frankly, I don't need to say anything to wrap this up. There's a funny video going around on the internet. Maybe it's been going around for a long time. I saw it last week. And it's the Crazy Dancer Guy video. It's about the importance of leadership and the importance of another group of people. The video is a guy dancing on a hillside, and he's a nut. He's a crazy nut, and everyone's sitting around sunbathing and having picnics, and there's a guy out there dancing, okay? As bad as I was just doing right there. Rudy and Peter, you are two crazy dancer guys. Now, the reason that they're the crazy dancer guys is because after a little while, there was another guy. Now there's two crazy dancer guys. The first nutty guy, the leader, and now his new friend, the first follower. Well, another minute goes by, and a couple more people join, and a few more people join. And after 3 or 4 minutes, there's 100 people out there having a great time dancing with the original crazy dancer guy. Two messages here. Number one, the importance of leaders who are doing something that is different and might be considered crazy and nutty by a lot of people. The impossible task that's taken on by leaders. Rudy and Peter, you're two crazy dancer guys. Your job is to be the followers. Join Rudy in his quest to take the impossible task of reconciling the need to feed people, the need to provide energy, and the all-important need to keep doing this long into the future by making all this sustainable. Feeding the world, frankly, now or in 2050, is not that hard of a job. We can do it. The problem is feeding the world without choking the planet, burning up the planet, and consuming all of the resources that we need for everything else, like fresh water, quality land, and air that isn't toxic from all sorts of things that we're putting there. Your job is to follow these two and help bring their vision to reality. The Danforth Center, we're following your leads. Peter, you're an icon. Rudy, you're new to the center. We've gotten to know each other over the past year and a half. We're inspired by what Rudy is doing, and we've ripped up our entire landscape out in front. Anyone who's driven by has seen that we've just got a big dirt field now around our construction site. We had a bunch of trees out there, beautiful trees. We bulldozed them down. That actually occurred in the middle of a donor event, a donor recognition event, with our windows wide open to a group of about 25 horrified individuals watching bulldozers take our trees down. But what's going to go in its place is a reconstructed Missouri prairie. And we're going to build it on the entire front and side of the property. And after a couple of years, if you just hang with us through a weedy-looking, messy period, it's going to be beautiful. We're doing it not just because of the landscaping opportunity. We're doing it because we want to make a statement that this is important. Thank you, Rudy. Thank you, Peter, for joining us.